Oh, what? Good morning. Tell you about a rat. Now, that's not the usual story people tell about rats. I mean, they're not most people's favorite animals. I mean, most of you wouldn't choose a rat for a pet if you were going to have one, but this here rat, he was a little different than most rats. Most rats don't like people, being around crowds and stuff. They kind of hide and slink here and there. Now, this here rat, he wanted more than anything to be part of the group. He liked people. He wanted to hang around them. He wanted to be, why? He just wanted to be there. But see, there was a problem. Now he lived right at the edge of an Indian village. And he lived in a hole, because that's where, at that time, most rats lived, was down in holes. And whenever he'd come out of this hole and strode on into the middle of the village, because that's where he wanted to be part of the group, and he'd make it out there in the middle of the village, all of a sudden somebody would see him and they'd yell, "Rat! Rat!" And they'd grab sticks and rocks and they'd start chasing him and throwing things at him, and he'd run back down in his hole. Now this upset him. He didn't like just, not being liked. But he was a rat, and not too many people like him. One night, real late, the rat woke up, came up out of his hole, and he went out into the woods to look for the smartest animal in the woods, the fox. And he went right up to the fox and said, "Mr. Fox, I've got a problem." And the fox looked at him and said, "Well, what's the problem?" "I'm a rat." Well, that's pretty obvious by looking at you. "Well, you see, the problem is people don't like rats, but I like people. I want to be there with them. I want to be part of the village. I want to run around and play. I want to be there. But every time I come up out of my hole and get out into the village, people yell, 'Rat, rat,' and they start throwing stuff, and I have to run back down to the hole and hide." Well, the fox thought a moment, and he said, "Well, part of the problem is living down in that hole. Now, you see, when you come up out of that hole, the first thing people think is, oh, there's a rat coming up out of that hole. Maybe. That's just an idea. But maybe if you were to change where you lived, that might make a difference." "Well, what do you mean? I've always lived in a hole." "Well, that's part of the problem. I'll tell you what you do. Move up into the top of the tallest tree right in the middle of the village and live up there. And then maybe when people look up, see you up in the tree, they'll think, wow, that's a different kind of animal. And they won't throw things at you." So that very night, the rat came back and he went down in the hole and he got all of his belongings and he carried them up and he went up to the very top of the tallest tree in the village and he took a bunch of leaves and stuff and he built him a nest up there, and that's where he was going to stay. Well, for a few days, things were fine. He'd stay down in them leaves, nobody would see him. And then he'd kind of come up out of them and crawl a little ways out on a limb. It's still kind of hidden, and he was way up there. Nobody really spent much time looking way up in the trees. But then one day, the rat, he came out, and he came down a few branches, and he went all the way out to the end of it. And he sat there. Now, a little boy came walking up, and he just happened to look up, and he saw the rat up there on the limb, and he thought a minute, and he said, "Rat, rat, rat in the tree!" And everybody came out and they grabbed sticks and rocks and they started throwing them at him up on the top of the tree, and he ran back way up to the top where they couldn't reach him and back in his nest. And he hid there. Well, when night came, he came back down the tree, back out into the forest, and he found the fox. He said, "Fox, this isn't working. I moved everything from out of the hole up into the tree, and everything was fine for a couple days until somebody saw me, and then rat, sticks and rock." It was a terrible scene. The fox looked at him, and he looked this way, said, "Well, there's one problem here. Even though you're living in a different place, you still look like a rat. What am I supposed to do about that? I can't help what I look like. I'm a rat, so I look like a rat." Fox thought a minute more and said, "You know, maybe we can change that." Said, "Now look here. You see this nice, big, fluffy, fuzzy tail of mine? Now, what does your tail look like?" The rat reached around, a piece of string. "Oh, you know, when people see me, they say, 'Oh, doesn't that fox have a beautiful tail?' If we could get you a fuzzy tail, I bet people would like you more." "How can I do that?" Fox said, "Well, I tell you what. Let's change your eating habits and see what happens. You see, I love to eat berries and nuts and all that kind of stuff. That's my favorite food. And I have this beautiful coat and fluffy tail. If you were to start eating berries and nuts and stuff, and see there's an advantage. You can get those things up in the trees, and they can't reach you with those sticks and rocks. If you were to eat those things, maybe you'd get a fuzzy tail." Well, the rat said it was worth a try. So every day, when he'd get up, he'd stay way up in the top of the trees, and he'd move all around, and he'd eat nuts and berries and all those things. And lo and behold, after a while, he noticed that little old skinny tail kind of looked like a piece of string, was starting to get a little fuzz on it. And as one day led to another, that fuzz got thicker and thicker and longer. And pretty soon, one day, the rat had this beautiful, fluffy, fuzzy tail. Well, he'd been hiding out, and nobody had seen him. So he figured he'd try out his new look, see how it worked. Came out of his nest, out on the limb. He was going to go for the whole thing. Came to the very furthest down limb on the tree and went all the way out to the end. And he took that old tail and he started moving it around and flapping it in the air to draw attention to himself. A little boy walked out, the same one that had seen him before, walked out and looked up and said, "Oh, he's so cute." And he called everybody from the village out, and they all came out, and they looked, and they all pointed, and they said, "Oh, he's so cute. Look at that fuzzy tail. Isn't he so cute?" And they went, and they got food, and they started throwing it up to him, and they laid it on the ground, and when he came down out of the tree to eat it, they even fed him right out of their hands. Nobody threw rocks, and nobody threw sticks. Why, his whole life was changed. Now, some of his relatives, they saw what happened, and they thought, "Hey, that's a pretty good deal. That's a whole lot better than getting chased. You know, we think we'll start eating those same things and see if maybe we can get a little change in appearance and a little change in attitude from those that see us." And that's just what they did. Now, you know, today, if you hadn't guessed yet, if you was to go out into your yard look up in the tree, you might see one of them things. Fuzzy tail. You call it a squirrel. But you know, in the Cherokee language, the translation for the word squirrel, it's tree rat. Them old cute fuzzy things you've been thinking was so nice and everything. A rat. A tree